Continuing with the idea of risk, people moved beyond the concept of divine will, destiny, fortune, and so on, as if the risk was something they could do nothing about, to considering risk as something that can be calculated, that can be prevented, that individuals had agency, and collective risk underwriting can happen, and so on. The idea of risk evolved further. The invention of such insurance schemes that we talked about in the last podcast of, ships going out for fishing or piracy or other adventures and them being underwritten in terms of their risk. The invention of such insurance schemes was paralleled by the emergence of basic notions of likelihood and probability. So people obviously had an idea of likelihood and probability, in a daily life of being attacked by a predator at nighttime versus daytime and so on. Initially among some true Renaissance men of the 15th and 16th century Italy, who seem to have been largely focusing on gambling. The following century saw a sharp increase in our understanding of these concepts with the first scientific publication in the Netherlands, the development of the first theory of probability in France, and the birth of modern statistics in England. However, their application of maritime insurance still initially resembled gambling at the coffee houses that mushroomed in London. One of these coffee houses was Lloyd's, and the rest is history. So Lloyd's went from a coffee house gambling den to being one of the largest insurance and reinsurance company, and now it exists with lots of competition, of course. So gambling was a main driver for the invention of risk. When you went gambling hoping to make money, you had to gamble with enough sense of the risk and the likelihood and probability of winning versus losing based on whatever the gambling method was. Over time, the focus of the meaning of risk slowly shifted from the older entrepreneurial concept of risk, with its focus on the potential advantages of decisions and ventures, toward our contemporary use of risk as something negative. We don't think of positive risk, right? It's always a negative risk. This challenge was increasingly noticeable since the beginning of the 19th century, perhaps as a result of our growing realization of the naivety in our optimistic view on science and progress of that time, when we experienced their limits and pitfalls in terms of environmental degradation, social upheaval, etc. Although the contemporary financial risk management of banks and insurance companies still adheres to the older view that risk can be either positive or negative, most other sciences differentiate between risk as something negative and opportunity as something positive. So banks are investing or giving loans, and they have to have a sense of default rates, likelihood of making money out of those at the interest rates that are set over the time that loan is made, and so on. So they called everything a risk, whereas now the concept of risk versus opportunity to make money and risk of losing money are now more of a concept. This latter view also represents an almost universal lay notion of risk, which I believe is an important indicator of its usefulness. I agree in other words with Hearn when championing garden variety concepts as opposed to the exotic. Though what did Hearn say? The ultimate test of a social science concept is not its beauty or arresting comparisons, but rather its utility. Does it help us identify and make sense of a distinct range of phenomena in all their variability? And one of the surest, though by no means fail-safe indicators of usefulness is the way a concept beds down into ordinary language, becoming a part of common sense. While common sense definitely needs to be examined and challenged at points, we should not lightly abandon normal everyday conceptions, because these will encode the practical experience of myriad speakers whose collective wisdom deserves respect, though not reverence. So empirical knowledge gets built into common sense, and then collective knowledge, crowdsourcing of common sense, becomes cultural mores, and in the action situation, how people interact with each other on repeated basis, on a daily basis, actually carries lots of information about perceived risk, likelihood, and probability in that context, which is what we would call this implicit common sense, or common sense with implicit sense of risk, right? So the conclusion of this longish chapter: we have conquered our planet, not only in the sense of populating all of its habitable corners, but also in the sense of our increasing influence on its vital systems. This influence has in modern times grown to such significance that a new geological period has been suggested, now the Anthropocene, in which mankind is reckoned with as a major geological force. The formality of defining a geological period has started looking for geological evidence that has to be established. Regardless of the academic debate around this particular suggestion, we must realize that we have become capable of both great deeds and great destruction, that we have pushed on to the edge of a cliff. However, we must also remember that we have been faced with numerous challenges over millennia, and so far we have always prevailed. Sometimes with great costs, sometimes with entire civilizations collapsing. We have adapted and moved on. There is always somebody who pays a price, and there are losers and winners, but now we are so aware, so globally connected, and information age is such that you cannot simply walk away from creating winners and losers. So we are in a slightly different framework in terms of how we want to prevail. The main issue may thus be not so much the survival of our species, but what costs we will pay at this time around, and we meaning global humanity and not just some people. An issue determined by how and when we will start to substantially address the current core challenges of humankind is the main issue. We have gone from having a global population of around 14 million at the time of the first cities to having 10 cities in the world with more than 14 million inhabitants each, and this number keeps growing. A situation that was completely impossible in agrarian society, let alone in hunter-gatherer society. The great transformations that took us between these categories of societies, or paradigms, or epistemes, if you will, and into industrial society, altered fundamentally our relationships with the environment and among ourselves. Considering the grave state that we are gradually realizing that we are in dire need of a new great transformation. Perhaps we are in the middle of one already. It is difficult to tell. These are not planned and designed, as we said. We just stumble upon them and realize we have gone into a new state of affairs. However, what we can expect by studying past social changes is that such transformation is conditional on a complex mix of economic, political, and ideological factors. Factors that we must attempt to align by mindful and intentional action, although the end result may be impossible to fully foresee and comprehend. So many local actions keep happening. What US is doing with the election coming up, what may happen depending on who wins, what Israel and Hamas are doing, what Russia and Ukraine are doing, and what the rest of the world is doing, watching and waiting, or fighting other battles in the meantime on the economic fronts for resources such as precious metals, critical minerals, and oil, gas, and so on. Shanghai, a growing megacity in a precarious location. So the idea of London, Shanghai, and so on, which evolved over time, London being one of the older cities, where you had great scope for livelihoods and ecosystem for innovation, and yet great gradients in wealth and misery, and the impacts of events, natural events such as winter storms, floods, and so on, were very much dependent on your per capita income, your social strata, how you were isolated or not from the rest of the society in the same small city. So these have become now complex ecosystems which attract a lot of people. Urbanization will continue, and yet these are transformations that have happened sometimes without any plan. So urban planning is a good word, but most cities have become quite evolved in a very unorganized fashion, and come with many disadvantages associated with those. So large cities have many advantages, many of them which relate to lives, livelihoods, and of course culture, music, museums, parks, transportation, etc. But you also have lots of disadvantages associated with them in terms of density of people, health risks, and so on. So we will leave this chapter here and come back and move to the next chapter to look at more on how our past defines our present, and how we have to understand the situation and then move on to conquering the situation. Okay, see you in the next chapter.